think, oh, I don't go to the toilet that much, and I don't drink that much. Oh, okay, I think I'm fine. But that wasn't true. Well, that's what I thought in the first place.
We're going to find out how Tim and Sita got on later in this episode, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. But first we need to do a couple of reminders. So diabetes is when your blood sugar levels get too high, but there are different forms. So you've got type 1, that's caused by a faulty immune system. You've got gestational diabetes, and that's a result of changes that happen in the body due to pregnancy. And then you've got the most common of them all, so type 2 diabetes, and that's largely driven by lifestyle. The International Diabetes Federation has attempted to calculate how many people are living with diabetes all around the world, and it has come up with a quite shocking number: 1 in 10 of all adults. That's more than 500 million of us. So I caught up with the Federation's president, Professor Andrew Bolton, who works at the University of Manchester. I suppose my first question is, why should we care about diabetes?
Well, we have a global pandemic of diabetes with more than 500 million people suffering from it. It's eminently preventable in its early stages and certainly in pre-diabetes, but if left untreated, it could lead to serious complications affecting the kidneys, the peripheral nerve, which is my specialty, the foot problem, amputations, blindness, and these are all eminently preventable if we diagnose people early. So it's a growing pandemic, and sadly, it's being worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic because, for example, 1 in 3 people dying in hospital with COVID has diabetes, and there is now COVID-induced diabetes.
Andrew, is diabetes taken seriously enough? I'm just thinking of something like type 2 diabetes. For some people, it's just, I need to change what I eat, and that's the level of seriousness that it's taken with sometimes. And kind of like 100 years on from the discovery and first use of insulin as a treatment, are we still not taking it as seriously as we should?
I think you're absolutely right. Let me give you an example. If someone is frightened of something or they fear it, they'll be screened. So people will have a prostate check or a mammogram because they are frightened of cancer. People will take a statin for heart disease because they're frightened of heart disease. They don't feel any better. But we often get to know, well, my grandmother had type 2 diabetes and she was 90, not realizing the seriousness of the condition and how much we can do early on.
Your Global Atlas is obviously a very big part of raising the profile of diabetes around the world. The latest figures, I think you mentioned 500 million people being diagnosed with some form, 1 in 10 adults in the world having some form of diabetes. How do you actually come to that number? Because there's obviously very good data in somewhere like the United Kingdom, but when you try to add that up across the whole of the world, I mean, that data is going to be sparse in some countries.
The data that are available, good from a number of countries. But many other countries have diabetes registers, and we try and get the best data we can, and we use our member associations, of which we have 170 across the world, to help the Atlas Committee identify people who might have the good data in individual countries. So it's not ideal, but it's getting better every time.
When we try to figure out why cases are going up, is it all about obesity and all about type 2 diabetes?
There is an increase also in type 1 diabetes, I should say, and further north you go in Europe, the more common type 1 diabetes is, and this is likely genetic. But type 2 diabetes is the vast majority of people, and it's a number of factors. For example, I look out of the window where I'm lecturing here in Cairo, I see the roads are full of traffic and nobody is walking. So there is this urbanization and reduced exercise, but also altered diet. But there's a strong genetic component. So people who have the genes that they're likely to develop type 2 diabetes and they become obese and less active, then this is going to bring on the condition, for one example.
So it's a symptom of our modern lives.
That's one of the major problems, yes.
One area that people have been focusing on and trying to prevent the number of people with diabetes is focusing on pre-diabetes. How useful do you think that is?
I think this is very important. Diabetes is eminently preventable, and I think you reported on a study from my friends in Newcastle and Glasgow, where you can send diabetes into remission by a very strict diet in its early stages. This is even more achievable in people with pre-diabetes, and these are people who have a simple blood test that shows that they're at higher risk of developing the disease. And a large study from Finland many years ago showed that if you randomize these people who are at risk of developing to diet, exercise, they reduce the impact of people going on to develop diabetes in that group compared with the control group by a half. And a similar study done in the United States, a diabetes prevention program, showed exactly the same reduction is achievable. So there's so much we can do early on.
Professor Andrew Bolton there. Now, the sheer scale of diabetes and the huge cost of treating it has increased attention on trying to prevent the disease in the first place. So the NHS Diabetes Prevention Programme is looking for people on the cusp of getting type 2, and it encourages them to be more active and to lose weight. So let's take a sneaky little listen to one of their courses.
Okay, so good morning everyone. This is your fourth session today. We'll talk about carbohydrates and a food that was such a hot topic in the last couple of sessions, and with plenty of questions. And we'll talk about other groups as well, like protein, fats, dairy, fruit and veg. And we'll finish like we normally do as well.
Courses like that rely on finding people who are at higher risk. But not everyone agrees with the term that's emerged. It's one called pre-diabetes, and diagnosing people with that. So to discuss in detail, we're joined by Dr. Samuel Seydoux from the Leicester Diabetes Centre and our resident GP, Dr. Margaret McCartney. Hello and welcome to Inside Health.
Hello.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you very much for having us.
Sam, can I start with you? Just in really simple terms, what is pre-diabetes?
Pre-diabetes is a state of blood glucose levels that is not high enough to diagnose diabetes, but again, it's not normal. So it is somewhere in between, and at that level you are at risk of developing diabetes. And so it is important that people know risk status, so that if there are measures in place that can help them from progressing to diabetes, they can undertake those interventions and prevent the condition from happening.
We're going to come to all of that. Margaret, one Inside Health listener called Andrew tweeted me going, how would you even know if you were pre-diabetic? I mean, without testing your blood sugar levels, are there any signs at all?
It's a diagnosis that you wouldn't have known about had you not gone for a blood test. But these would be people that are being picked up, and a common source that's being diagnosed would be as part of the health check scheme that's done in NHS England. But other people might get it done, for example, if they're being monitored with their high blood pressure, or after they've had a heart attack or a stroke, for example.
Sam, are people at different risks of developing pre-diabetes, the same as they are for diabetes? I'm guessing they are. Are there certain people that you want to pay much closer attention to?
Risk factors for diabetes will be things like the age, the ethnicity, the gender of the patient. Those ones you cannot modify. However, there are other risk factors that you can control, and they are things like your amount of fat that you put around your core area. And so we measure that by measuring your waist circumference. If you're a female, it's 88 centimeters, and if you're a male, it's 102. It shouldn't be more than that.
I've done a little test. It's on the Diabetes UK website, and it makes you answer a list of questions: how old you are, gender, ethnicity, what your kind of like height and weight are, to try to figure out all those different risk factors and add it all together. I was quite proud of my result. I have a risk score of 1, which is in the low risk of diabetes category. What are people generally like? Does everybody have a risk score of 1? What's it like actually?
No, I think you'll be one of the rarer examples. The vast majority of people in the UK would have a very high risk or moderate risk, because some data suggests about 60% of us are overweight in the country. You probably are one of the fittest in the country.
Oh, can I have that on a t-shirt? No. Do you understand, Sam, why in different ethnicities you do get this different risk at different ages and different body mass indexes? I mean, like it's simple to say, oh, it's genetics, but what does that actually mean?
So that's an interesting question. It's an area of research, and what we do know is that South Asian populations tend to gather fat around their belly. So they have the bad fat around their abdominal area, whereas white Asians will have their fat stored under the skin. So the amount of fat you have around your core is what translates to your resistance to the hormone that you need for regulating your sugar, which is the insulin. And so we tend to say that South Asian patient with diabetes is more insulin resistant because of the amount of fat that you have around the core area. Now, if you then move the story to the Black and Afro-Caribbean population, it's slightly more complex. There is some data coming out from King's College in London showing that they tend to have less functioning of their cells that produce the insulin, the beta cells. So the beta cell function is slightly less in black people compared to other ethnicities. But what we do know is that they are also 2 to 4 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes compared to the white population.
Sam, in terms of the term pre-diabetes, I mean, how useful is it? How many people who you might label as having pre-diabetes actually go on to develop type 2 diabetes?
Tend to refrain from using the term pre-diabetes. There's only one certainty in life, and that is death. You cannot be that sure that if you have the precursor of the condition, you definitely are going to progress to diabetes. And so what Diabetes UK prefers us to use is the term those at high risk of diabetes. And so it's not all patients with so-called pre-diabetes who actually progress to develop diabetes. All you got to do is know your risk, do something about it, and there is a big chance that you revert to normal glucose levels.
So, Margaret, it sounds like a no-brainer. We should be looking for people with the early stages of diabetes.
So there's no question, if someone has got symptoms that might suggest diabetes, they should go and speak to somebody about that and work out what to do. But if someone's got no symptoms at all, the question is, why are you testing? And you should be testing for a purpose. And that's the very good philosophy here. That's the aim, is to try and intervene early with the condition so that you can stop people from developing complications. However, there's lots of problems inside this. And one of them is even trying to diagnose what is normal and what is abnormal, because if you look in America, for example, they've used different scores. And depending on where you draw the lines, you could be including massive amounts of the population, a third of adults, for example, in some paper studies. So there are really big problems, I think, when you start to diagnose a huge amount of the population with a risk factor, because the question is what happens to that risk factor over time. And in fact, many people who have been diagnosed with an abnormal glucose will actually go back to normal without doing anything about it. So what we're really trying to find are the people in that group who have a high blood sugar, who will go on to have higher blood sugars in the future, and where you can do something useful to intervene in order to help them feel better or have a better or longer quality or quantity of life.
Can you just explain for me how this is different then to something which we're much more familiar with, like looking at people with high blood pressure or people with high cholesterol levels that we then go on to give statins or blood pressure medication to? Because it sounds a lot like other forms of preventative medicine looking for pre-diabetes.
It's very similar. It's all essentially the same, taking people who are well or who believe themselves to be well, looking for risk factors and then trying to offer interventions that might work. And certainly there are some people who will benefit, but there's going to be a lot of people who don't benefit.
Sam, what do you think?
Yeah, I see where Margaret is coming from, but where else would you send these resources? Diabetes screening is not done in isolation. It's done, we screen for diabetes alongside other things, including blood pressure and lipid, and all of these contribute significantly to cardiovascular disease, which is one of the biggest killers. There has been a trial that was done here in the UK alongside other countries across Europe, the Addition trial, which actually screened people for diabetes and put a multifactorial intervention in place that seemed to be neutral. Having said that, if you then look at the other screening programs that have been conducted, we have seen that we have been able to reduce the risk of diabetes. I think there is merit in screening.
So, Sam, we have the NHS Diabetes Prevention Programme, the aim to enrol 100 or 1,000 people every year to try to reduce their risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Do we actually have any evidence, any data to say that that's having a positive impact?
So, yeah, we have had the initial data reported, and the outcomes were actually very encouraging. They were able to demonstrate weight loss of 3.3 kilograms in those who were overweight, and they did also see some benefits in the long-term glucose control in those patients who were enrolled. Importantly, in the interim analysis, we actually saw a fifth of people from ethnic minority groups actually participating in the program, which I found very interesting. People from the ethnic minority groups tend to get diabetes much younger. And as we know, if you are young and you get type 2 diabetes, the disease is a lot more aggressive.
Margaret, is there an issue here that even dealing with people that have pre-diabetes or screening for diabetes, are we again failing to tackle the bigger problem as to why society is leading people to get into that state in the first place?
Yes. I can see where that's coming from, but not everyone takes the check, then not everyone in the health check takes up the offer of going onto a programme after that to help, and then lots of people don't attend all of their sessions, so you get fewer and fewer people through to the next stage all the time who end up getting a good outcome, and it's very important for them, obviously, but it does beg the question of what happens to everybody else, and perhaps they were the people that were at highest risk to start off with. And I suppose what I'm really getting at here is that this is one way to look at risk factors, and that's very an individualised way when you're asking individual people to take actions. But there are other ways to look at this as well, and that's talking about the bigger public health interventions where you don't have to think about it. Things are automatically made easier for you. But the problem is that you're fighting against the tide, and the society that we live in makes it extremely easy. In fact, the default position, I would argue, is for us to become overweight and inactive and to have high sugars because that's the environment we live in. And I'm much more interested in actually trying to think, where are all the problems coming from that we perhaps don't appreciate that we're trying to deal with every day and that are coming to us whether or not we've chosen them? Are there actually things in our environment that are far better off to be targeted so we help everyone?
Doctors Margaret McCartney and Samuel Seydoux there. Well, two people who are trying to fight that tide that Margaret described are Sita and Tim, who we heard from at the start of the episode. Let's find out what happened next.
Originally and initially, when I was told about the programme, I was a little bit sceptical because I kind of thought, well, what could they possibly be teaching me? You know, I feel I'm quite healthy, I'm a vegetarian, I eat pretty well. However, after my first session, I was so blown away, like an hour and a half of education, just about kind of, you know, how I could become healthier and about the food choices I could make. And, you know, for me, 100%, it was really the best thing. I mean, I am due to have to take a visit to the GP and have my blood tests done again, just to kind of see where we're doing with the whole pre-diabetic diagnosis.
The first time I went to my doctor, I would think I was like 23 stone. Now I lost almost 5 stone, and I was told that the blood sugar was normal. The doctor said, "Wow, how did you do it?" I said, "Doctor, I did work so hard." And then my tablet that was prescribed, they reduced it from 10 milligram to 5 milligram. My cholesterol stayed the same, and the reason why was because I'm a meat eater. I love my meat, but I've reduced it right now. I tend to eat more fish now, and I know the next time I go for a checkup, it will be reduced, my cholesterol.
I have lost 2 stone, which is a great achievement. I mean, it's taken a long time. However, I do feel by kind of eating healthy and doing the regular exercise, it has really it's kind of boosted my confidence as well, because of the type of industry I work in. Appearance and image is everything, so it's definitely made me feel a lot more confident within my own self. I've been going to yoga, so I'm a lot more flexible. You know, I do the body pump as well, and then I do use the weights as well. So people have started noticing that I look a lot more toned in my clothing. So, you know, for anybody who has been diagnosed with pre-diabetes or high cholesterol or even diabetes, I would 100% recommend this program. And, you know, and of course the other thing is not everybody does become diabetic. So this program is definitely more of a prevention, so I can be making all these changes, which are great, but I could still then, you know, become diabetic, because there is no, you know, yes, you're going to become diabetic, or no, you're not going to become diabetic. Either way, for me, I feel it's great that I've been educated. So, you know, being quite young, I feel, you know, for me, it was a real shock. And, you know, I do take health extremely seriously, because for me, health is wealth. And, you know, I'm quite an active person. I've got a lot of life to live yet. So, you know, I do want to be really, really healthy, just so I can do all the things that, you know, that I desire to do.
My family did not see me for quite a long time. We're completely shocked. This was, how did you do it? Even my aunties, like, how did you do it? People thought I actually did liposuction. They actually thought I did it. And the reason why there's a lot of diabetes in African culture is because of our food. We eat too much oily food. And also because part of our culture is about, you know, giving food as well. So imagine if I go to my mom's place, I mean, if you come with me, you think that the food that for me alone, you think it's going to be for like 6 or 7 people, but that food is just for me alone, right? But that's just part of our culture. People need to start understanding that, you know, portion control does really help. During that program, the food that I love during the program that they told us was, I love bulgur wheat. I've never had bulgur wheat. And also lentils, that's a lot of protein as well in there. And so those are the food I've incorporated in my lifestyle and that I love that I eat. I do sleep well now, and I don't even snore anymore actually. Now I can tie my laces now. I'm so pleased with myself. I'm like so energetic. It's like my body function just changed totally. It's like I'm Superman. It's like, you know, my love life is so good now, honestly.
That's what you call a happy customer. Thanks to Tim and Sita for sharing their experiences. Let's hope they can both keep it up. It's time for Rohin in Space-ish. Because ever since our cardiologist, Dr. Rohin Francis, was a child, he's dreamed of a life among the stars. So we boldly sent him where no Inside Health reporter has gone before.
I'm on a plane for the first time in 2 years, but I'm not going on holiday. In fact, this plane is going to land exactly where it took off, in Bordeaux, because I'm on a parabolic or weightless flight, colloquially known as the Vomit Comet. You see, I never grew out of that common childhood dream of becoming an astronaut, and this year I finally got my chance to apply as the European Space Agency opened applications for the post of astronaut for the first time in 12 years. And considering they received 23,000 applications, it's no surprise that I've not heard anything back yet. But experiencing weightlessness while taking part in a scientific experiment is a pretty cool consolation prize. There's a quiet buzz from the scientists who are around me as we climb to altitude before embarking on 31 unbelievably steep parabolas. They're all anxiously making their final adjustments ahead of huge moments in their careers as they test their hypotheses in zero gravity. On board are the European Space Agency, NASA, and several research teams from around the world. Experiments on board are both physical science, such as fundamental questions about quantum physics or how heat behaves in zero gravity, but two of them are medical. One is a team from St. Mary's University testing a novel jumping sled as a potential countermeasure to prevent bone and muscle loss in space, and the other is run by NASA, a team studying blood flow in the jugular veins draining from the brain down to the heart, after their shocking discovery 2 years ago that multiple astronauts on the International Space Station had blood flow that had stopped, reversed, or even developed into clots. And two of the jugulars that they're going to be studying today belong to me. I'm one of the 4 test subjects that'll be trying hard to keep my breakfast down as my neck veins are scanned. At the bottom of the truck, what you see now is double gravity, which is not particularly pleasant.
40. Ejection.
And then, the most remarkable feeling, as weight leaves your body, you drift up from your seat and completely lose track of which way is up as we experience weightlessness. We get around 22 seconds of weightlessness each parabola. Aaron from NASA is scanning my neck, and amazingly, the blood seems to stop flowing briefly. I have to say, there's no nausea at all, just an indescribable feeling of floating around. Both the medical experiments here seem removed from the rather more run-of-the-mill kind of medicine I normally practice back on terra firma, but both could provide vital information for patients on Earth. With billionaires racing heavenward, some people are starting to regard space exploration as almost frivolous. But I have to say that feels a million miles from the atmosphere here, a reminder that space has always been about scientific discovery, including huge amounts of medical research that has a direct impact on distinctly more terrestrial medicine as well.
That sounded like so much fun, and what a great way to end this series. We're off to hibernate for a bit, but don't worry, Inside Health will return in the new year. So, see you all then.
Inside Health was presented by James Gallagher, produced by Geraldine Fitzgerald, and the studio manager was Sarah Hockley. It's The World Tonight in half an hour with Rizla Shah, and she's here now with a preview.
Hello, Mairead. Tonight we head to Glasgow, where James Menendez is at the UN Climate Change Conference for the programme. He'll be discussing the importance of today's deal to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. Also, we'll discuss whether Joe Biden can chalk up his time at COP26 as a success. We report from Ethiopia, where another group is taking up arms against the government, and we hear why fears are growing about the security of the peace deal that's kept Bosnia's tensions at bay. That's all coming up on The World Tonight at 10.
With Rizla Shah. But now on Radio 4, with the Life Scientific, it's Jim Al-Khalili.
My guest today has led one of the genuine success stories of the pandemic. She is microbiologist Professor Sharon Peacock, the founding director of COG UK, the COVID-19 Genomics UK Consortium. COG UK is the network of scientists and labs around the country that has acted as our surveillance system for the appearance and spread of new and more dangerous variants of concern. Thanks to Sharon and her colleagues, it's something the UK was far ahead in doing than any other country, and it paid off. For example, it was the genomic sequencing of virus samples by the consortium that last December identified the fast-spreading Alpha, or so-called Kent variant. This was the variant responsible for the terrible second wave of last winter. Before the pandemic, Sharon was a pioneer and advocate for the application of genome sequencing in the health service to tackle the growing menace of antibiotic resistance. She's a consultant in microbiology and professor of public health at the University of Cambridge. And as you'll hear, this is not a list of titles and achievements Sharon would have possibly imagined when she left school at 16 to work full-time in her local corner shop. Sharon Peacock, welcome to the Life Scientific.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
Can you explain what the COG UK Consortium is and what it does?
It's a group of around 600 largely volunteers across the country in around 16 different sequencing sites that got together at the start of the pandemic to really deliver genome sequencing for the UK pandemic response. And so it's made up of people in academic institutions, universities, and in the public health agencies, together with the Wellcome Sanger Institute. We link up to over 100 different hospital testing labs and the Lighthouse labs that test samples that come from the community. And so it's a bit like a spider's web, it's a network of testing and sequencing capabilities.
And in very broad brush terms, what is it that you can learn from sequencing all these virus samples?
When SARS-CoV-2 first emerged, all of the kind of offspring, if you like, were identical. But as the virus begins to evolve and change its genetic code, we need to be able to pick that up. And so what we can do is sequence viruses and compare them to each other to see how related they are. But really importantly, we have to find mutations and combinations of mutations in variants so that we can start to categorize viruses. And that's really how we picked up the variants of concern. We can then start to study whether their behaviour is different to other variants, and that's key in working out whether we should be concerned about a variant or not.
Maybe you can give us some stats showing the extent that COG UK has led the way globally, in fact, in COVID genomic surveillance.
Well, right now, the genomes we've generated over 1 million. All of the genomes we give openly to global databases, and in particular something called GISAID. And at the moment, our genomes make up around a quarter of the genomes in that database. There was a time a bit earlier on in the response when the genomes that we had released made around 50% of the global total. And so given the size of our kind of country and our population, that's quite a significant achievement, I think.
And presumably countries that don't have this sort of genetic information are going to be blind about how the virus might be changing there.
That's a fact that pains me a great deal. Some countries don't have access to sequencing. There's an increasing number that do have access now, but there are some countries that are blind. And that's a problem, because if you don't know what's emerging in your country, that has implications for your population, in that you don't know whether that variant, if it's a variant of concern, could evade the immune system, for example, or be more transmissible. But also, other countries won't be alerted to the fact that a variant of concern has emerged. So we have to be sequencing everywhere, because this is our eyes on the ground.
Now then, Sharon Peacock, given that you've been leading this this nationally important operation and that you're Professor of Public Health and Microbiology at Cambridge University, people might be surprised to learn that you left school at 16. This was back in the mid-70s, really without any career ambitions.
Yes, that's right. Well, going back a bit earlier than that, I failed something called the 11 plus. And that was a real decider for many people. And so I went to secondary modern school. And there the focus wasn't on qualifications that you would take to get into university. And we all left at 16. And so I was actually prevented from taking what we called O-level, but they're now GCSE equivalent, in maths, physics and chemistry. And I left school at 16 because that was the expectation of everyone at the school. So there was a lot of talented people there, but the expectation was that we would leave and get a job. And that's exactly what I did. I got a job full-time in a corner shop where I'd been working part-time, and that made logical sense at the time.
Well, after working in that corner shop for a while, you then get a job as a dental nurse, which I understand was what sparked your interest in caring.
I was working in the shop and they had a notice board, and on that notice board was a job advert for a dental nurse, and it was like 3 doors up. And so I got that job and I loved it. It really sparked in me something around caring for other people. And I worked there for 2.5 years and had a very happy time with a single practice dentist.
So being interested in caring got you interested in training as a nurse more generally?
Yeah, I felt that I wanted to move towards something more holistic and look after the whole person. So I applied to be a nurse. I had trouble getting in because I didn't have the science qualifications again, but I was accepted to do my nursing training and I started nursing. Now, about 6 months in, I was working on a male medical ward, and I was watching junior doctors examine patients, take a history, do diagnostic tests and come up with diagnoses, and I thought, wow, I would love to do that. That is just so interesting. I can't imagine why I even had the confidence to think that I could do that myself, but I just, at that point, that was a eureka moment. I thought, I have to do that. I didn't tell anyone at the time.
Really?
It was, I feared that people might laugh at me, and perhaps they would have actually. So I set a path about how I would do that. I completed my nursing training, which I did enjoy very much, but I took myself off to evening classes to get O-levels in maths, physics and chemistry. And then once I'd finished nursing training, I specialised in end-of-life care. Now that gave me some flexibility. I was working in the community. It gave me the flexibility to work on A-levels, which I did part-time in a technical college. So at the same time as nursing, I was doing my scientific sort of A-levels, and finally it all came together and I got my 3 A-levels.
So then, next step, how easy was it to get into medical school?
Oh, it was a challenge. I like challenges, but I was rejected twice through 2 application cycles. And I thought, well, I don't really want to leave it there, having made this much effort and having kind of this wish to be a doctor. I am quite tenacious. So I picked up the phone and rang up the University of Southampton. And I said, look, just consider me, just meet me. So the admissions tutor, he met me, and he must have seen something in me because he offered me a place, and I was in medical school within a month studying medicine.
But of course, you were now in your early 20s at this stage, so a delayed route into university, I guess, and then on, as we'll hear, into medical research. So did you, or have you ever encountered any snootiness or discrimination or doubts about your ability because of this unusual path?
The answer has to be yes, but it's less than you might think. The major doubts, I think, came from myself. From my own background, was I as good as everybody else? Could I do the job? And so that was the thing I really had to overcome, and I think trying to come to terms with the fact that my past didn't define me, it just taught me important lessons. In terms of my colleagues, I didn't really tell them my backstory very much. I tended to suppress it, and I've done that until fairly recently, and I've come out to talk about it now as hopefully a way of encouraging others to really go for what they want to do.
Now, Sharon Peacock, forgive me here for massively compressing your life story, but there's just so much to say. You qualify as a doctor in 1988 and work in hospitals in Southampton, London, Brighton and Oxford. And it was in Oxford that you begin to do research on bacterial infection and disease. You get a PhD, become a consultant in microbiology, and then go off to Thailand for 7 years with 3 young children researching tropical infectious diseases. In 2009, you return to the UK, to Cambridge, and your research takes a new direction, which laid the foundations for what we're doing now in tackling COVID-19 pandemic. You were working on antibiotic resistance.
Well, when I came back from Thailand, I knew that I couldn't really transfer my research group or my research interests back into the UK. And I was thinking hard about what I would do. And around that time, sequencing technology was really coming up to the point where we could use it in hospitals. The machines can be as small as the size of a cappuccino machine. And I looked at the potential of that and I thought, how can we really get that innovation to help our fight against a problem? And I thought about antibiotic resistance. Now, we talked a lot about antibiotic resistance before COVID-19 came along, and it's going to come back in our discussions quite soon, I think. This is a really serious and worrying issue. It's a slow burn pandemic. We're overusing antibiotics, and therefore we are generating highly resistant bacteria that are causing infections and leading to a higher rate of death. So I really got the opportunity and the problem to come together. And I started to really explore how I could use this sequencing technology quite close to the patient to better understand the evolution of antibiotic resistance, the transmission of resistant pathogens, and also trying to see how it could help us with things like outbreaks in hospitals in the community.
So we're talking here about lots of different microbes that might develop this antibiotic resistance, MRSA in hospitals, drug-resistant tuberculosis. Basically, these are infections that become untreatable with drugs, and it is a huge global problem, isn't it?
At this point in time, there are a few infections that are completely untreatable, but in many countries, actually the antibiotics that you need are not available. And so this is a real problem, and we can better understand how these resistant pathogens can spread from one place to another. We can better understand how to treat people if we can do sequencing, and I think that TB is a great example. So drug-resistant TB, it can take weeks or months to really establish using laboratory techniques that it's a highly resistant strain. You can sequence and predict that very quickly, and this is where sequencing can really help you both in patient care but also in your infection control and your public health.
And is the use of genome sequencing for this purpose that you've pioneered now routine for hospitals?
It's not at the moment, but I think that as technology improves and we can use instruments very close to the patient, it will become so. I think that the pandemic has been the breaking through of a glass ceiling in terms of people's understanding of the power of pathogen sequencing and the importance of it actually for public health and patient care. There's more research to do to bring it to use for different reasons, but there is no going back now.
Okay, so let's get on to the current pandemic, Sharon Peacock. How and when did COG UK, the COVID-19 Genomics Consortium, come into being, and what was your role in its origins? Because your part was pretty pivotal, wasn't it?
I'd been talking with Sir Patrick Vallance, our government chief science advisor, about the importance of genomics, as well as with Chris Whitty, and they were very supportive. And so on the 4th of March, actually, when there were very few diagnosed cases in the country, that's 4th of March 2020, I sent 5 emails to academic colleagues to say, can you call me today? And everyone called me that day. And my question to them was, I think we need to set up a sequencing capability in the UK. What do you think? And they were all completely supportive. So within 2 days, actually by the 6th, I'd sent out 20 invites to people saying, next week we're going to hold a meeting at the Wellcome Trust building in Euston Road, at which we're going to talk about how to set this up. Can you come? And that's where it all got started.
And that meeting was on the 11th of March 2020, so roughly 2 weeks before the UK started the first lockdown on the 26th.
It was. I remember that meeting very vividly. My phone was constantly going off because, at the time it was really very busy. And we spent the whole day not talking about the science, but where would we sequence, who would sequence, how would we sequence, how could we bring all of that together? So it was the nuts and bolts of the operations, and by the end of the day, we had a blueprint, and within 3 days, we had a full scientific proposal on Patrick Valence's desk saying, Patrick, I know you're supportive, this is what we would like to do next.
Well, Patrick Valence was supportive, but there were some scientists who thought this would all be a waste of time and resources.
There were people who thought that because the virus mutated slowly, and I'd put that in inverted commas actually, because with so many cases in the world, the virus has had lots of opportunities to mutate, but they thought this is a slow mutating virus, and you're going to be just sequencing the same thing over and over and over again. I would be the first to admit that that's what we did initially, but what we needed to do was actually gear up. Rather than wait until we suddenly realised if we'd waited until alpha to start sequencing, we wouldn't have been prepared. And so we got ready, we got everything in place, and we were sequencing at relatively high volume by the time that the variants of concern emerged. And those criticisms, obviously, they were quite difficult to deal with, but when I was lying in bed at night kind of worrying about it, I'd say, well, if the worst comes to the worst, people will have published a lot of scientific papers that haven't really contributed to public health, but that's not the end of the world, and we're just going to get going here and be prepared.
It didn't worry you sufficiently at any point to make you doubt that maybe you weren't doing the right thing?
I doubted a lot.
Right.
My mind was full of doubt. I would be saying, are we doing that? I don't think I ever vocalised that. So when I saw on Twitter, for example, that this wasn't a great idea, or that we were just going to be sequencing again and again, I was surrounded by people that did believe that this was the right thing to do. But coming back to my kind of tenacity, I continued anyway, and I'm kind of glad that we as a team, we kept going.
Anyway, you had COG UK up and running at the start of April last year. Did you soon start to see variants of concern or evidence of genetic diversity that was important to know about?
In the first wave, there was a great deal of diversity. So there were thousands of different variants, and a variant is basically a SARS-CoV-2, which has got a combination of mutations which then classify it as a sort of variant. There were thousands of variants that we could see that had been introduced into the country, and at that point, I don't think we really knew enough about whether the mutations that were developing were of significance or not. Certainly looking back, there was nothing of great concern in that first wave. The virus was evolving as it does through natural selection, and so we saw a lot of diversity then. During that early time, we were really sharpening our pencils, developing our tools really, to spot when something would emerge that would be problematic for us.
And you mentioned earlier that for a long time the UK was at the forefront of genome sequencing in the pandemic. How come?
Well, I think that we have remained actually at the forefront, and I think we've done that in part because of our history. We had been studying pathogen sequencing for a decade, we had political and financial support, and we had a group of people that were willing to come together. But the amazing thing about this pandemic is that the 600 scientists were really dedicated to try and make a difference. So the opportunity for a scientist to actually go to work and make a difference to the pandemic is something very special. I hear that a lot. So I think that we've remained at the forefront because of a combination of our capabilities, but also our willingness just to get up in the morning, go and do the job and get those genomes out to public health agencies. And with these 600 incredible people, we've done what we've done because of them and their families, actually, who supported us.
Who've had to sacrifice when
They
they're
have.
putting in all those hours.
They have, yes.
Yeah. Can you tell me the story of the discovery of the Alpha variant, which back in late 2020 people were calling the Kent or UK variant? It was spreading like wildfire towards the end of last year and sadly killed many tens of thousands of people in the following months. What was COG UK's role in identifying it?
We generated the data for public health agencies, and so all of the sequence was generated by COG UK over the period of alpha emergence. We'd also generated the interpretation tools. So sequence needs to be interpreted, and it needs to be interpreted very quickly, and COG UK members had developed tools to analyse the data, and also to deposit the data in something called CLIME. It's a cloud infrastructure. So we made that available to public health agencies. And in addition, our scientists joined their team to look at, when you combine the genome information with the very detailed epidemiological information that they gather, how do you make sense of that? And it was that spread in Kent, that kind of very early expansion, together with overlaying the genetic information, where people really concluded that something unusual was going on here that we hadn't seen before. And the completely standout characteristic for alpha was that it was around 50% more transmissible than the variants that had come before.
So how important do you feel that discovery and characterization of alpha was in persuading the government to tighten the mixing restrictions over Christmas last year and institute the lockdown in January? Because the escalation in cases, deaths and overwhelmed hospital was awful anyway as we were approaching Christmas. Did the work of COG UK make any difference to policy, do you think?
I like to think it did. If you have an expansion of cases, you have pressure on hospitals, then actually going into lockdown is the right thing to do. You don't need to know whether it's a variant of concern. So the lockdown was precipitated by the expansion of cases and the fact that there were high rates of cases and hospital admissions. However, realising that this was something different, that there was something that was more transmissible, I think helped to push us towards thinking that actually this is something that needed more containment, and you needed extra interventions to be able to get on top of that. So I do believe that knowing that this was alpha did influence the decision.
And if I take you back to that Christmas period, last Christmas, with the alpha variant spreading so rapidly then across the whole country, how intense was the workload for you and the COG UK scientists at that time?
I remember writing an email on the 18th of December, and in that email I sent a Christmas card and also a letter of thanks from Sir Patrick Vallance saying thank you for all the work that you've been doing. And in that email I said, I know that you've been committed to this, really focused on delivering this, your families have supported you. Thank you so much. I think that, this is history in the making, and see you shortly. And what we'd done is we hadn't stopped sequencing, but we reduced our output so that we were ticking over. And that was a good moment. It's a Friday evening actually that I sent it, and it was a good moment to thank everybody. Unfortunately, on Saturday there was a press briefing, and by the Sunday I was writing an email to everyone saying, I unwisely emailed you on Friday saying that it was time to reduce to a skeleton stuff and keep sequencing ticking over, because actually what I'm going to do now is call you all back. So for everybody who can, we all have to come back. We all have to increase our sequencing. We really have to get on top of producing many more genomes. We have to get genomes across the country to see where this spread is occurring. And I also indicated that we'd be having meetings every day to look at our output. And I said I'd try and avoid meetings on Christmas Day and Boxing Day, but I couldn't be sure about that. So it was that was an interesting moment in time.
So you didn't have Christmas time off from telly and relaxing, eating mince pies?
If you look at my email trail, I think the story would be that I was very busy, and as were many of my colleagues, keeping the sequencing going.
And after Alpha, of course, we've had the even more transmissible Delta variant coming into the UK and producing a third wave. And, of course, it's now the dominant variant. Thankfully, we've had many fewer deaths due to the vaccines, but with ongoing high rates of infection, presumably there's no slowdown in the work of COG UK.
Well, certainly there's no slowdown in the rate of sequencing. We need to keep a very careful watch on the Delta variant, because we've had around 750,000 cases in the UK, at least documented. And each case will be an opportunity for the virus to mutate and actually look for a chink in armor and become more transmissible still or more immune evasive. So we need to keep a very careful watch on Delta. In terms of COG UK, we have largely handed over our routine sequencing work to public health agencies, because after all, we were stood up in an emergency, and researchers don't generally do the routine work of public health agencies, so we've handed over. But we are particularly busy at the moment because we are focusing on how we link the viral genomes with other genome data, particularly human genomes, and very detailed patient information. So we're really focusing on research, the science again, which is very exciting. we've never really put together human genomes, our genomes, with pathogen genomes to find out what extra we could find out. This could lead us down a path of really understanding why some people get bad disease. Can we get into artificial intelligence? Can we predict who's going to come into hospital and actually have a poor outcome? And so we're busy looking at new research angles. We're also looking at areas such as applying sequencing to antibiotic resistance and to future pandemic preparedness.
You mentioned that being prepared for future variants of the virus. What is the likelihood of new dangerous variants emerging somewhere in the world and spreading?
I wish I knew the answer to that. The chances of a variant emerging are going to be higher if there's uncontrolled infection around the world. And so we need to vaccinate to suppress the rate of infection everywhere. Because all the while people are being infected, the virus has got a chance to emerge. But there's several possibilities about whether the virus will change again. The first is that actually it won't change and it's kind of backed itself into a blind corner, and biologically it can't get out of it. An alternative is that Delta is able to tweak itself a bit, and so through a natural selection some mutations come together, and this is quite complicated now. It's like pieces on a chessboard. You have to get the mutations in a particular order to be fitter. We don't know if that's going to be possible. I guess the third possibility is that a new variant of concern emerges that's completely different from Delta. We haven't got any evidence that that's happening at the moment. We have to watch very carefully. It's going to have to be a pretty powerful variant because it's got to overcome the absolute dominance of Delta at the moment. So if we sequence, we watch those, some people have predicted that the virus will become like the common cold. I don't think that's going to happen in the next, anytime soon, in the next year or so. So I think we have to keep watching this and learn as we go along as to what the virus is going to do next. And I don't think anybody can truthfully say they know what's going to happen next.
And as far as the UK is concerned, how are you feeling about the next few months?
I do feel concerned. I feel concerned for two reasons. First, at the moment, we have a high rate of COVID-19 cases, and that does concern me. The second reason to be concerned is that we haven't really seen influenza for the last 18 months. We've had almost no influenza in the country because we've been keeping our distance, working at home, not going out if we feel unwell, etc. So our immunity to influenza will have waned, and with the flu season coming, then that's what worries me. And of course there's a big influenza vaccination campaign going on now, but the convergence of a high number of people with influenza and a high number of people with COVID-19 is a worry. I particularly worry about the NHS. So I'm on the board of Adam Brooks Hospital, and so I get an inside view on what's happening there, and I worry not only for patients with infectious diseases but those with cancer, heart disease. They need a hip replacement, a knee replacement, and so I'm going into the winter with a sense of concern, I have to admit.
Sharon Peacock, thank you very much for sharing your Life Scientific.
Thank you. It's been great to talk to you today.
The Life Scientific is presented by Jim Al-Khalili and produced by Andrew Luckbaker. On this week's Fortunately, Fee Glover and Jane Garvey meet the broadcaster Gabby Logan, who shares stories of the pastimes of her Match of the Day colleagues and some of her best bloopers. That's at 11. But now, before we join Ritual Shah for The World Tonight, let's take a look at the weather. Northern and western parts of the UK, along with North Sea coasts of England, will see showers pushing southwards. Many remaining southern and eastern areas will be dry with clear spells, but it's another cold night with frost and fog for some. Tomorrow, early fog and frost will lift. Northern Ireland and both western and eastern coasts of Britain will see showers throughout the day, which may be heavy at times. Further inland, it will be drier with some sunny spells, but a few showers will develop during the afternoon, especially over central and eastern England. A breezier and chilly day. Looking ahead then, Thursday will remain chilly and breezy with sunny spells and a few showers. Friday will be cloudier and milder with patchy rain across the north and west, but a few sunny spells in the south and east. And that's our look at the weather. You're listening to BBC Radio 4.
It's 10 o'clock. Good evening. This is The World Tonight with Ritual Shah. President Biden's criticised the absence of China and Russia, two of the world's biggest polluters, from the climate change conference in Glasgow, and he announced a global pledge to cut methane emissions.
Together, we're committing to collectively reduce our methane by 30% by 2030, and I think we could probably go beyond that. And it's going to make a huge difference.
But the president faces more political challenges at home. Also, the conflict in Ethiopia is escalating. We have rare access to the insurgents fighting the government in the country's Oromia region.
The Oromo people have been forced to take up arms. We are fighting, living in the forest like animals, because we want our rights to be respected.
And echoes of the past from the Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik.
He said he will create his own arming his police. So this is his long-term plan, as it was during the war, to get independence of Republika Srpska.
Is Bosnia in danger of falling apart? We hear from a former international representative. That's all after the BBC News read tonight by Caroline Nichols. Boris Johnson has said he's cautiously optimistic about global efforts to tackle climate change after world leaders set out a series of significant deals at the COP26 summit in Glasgow. The Prime Minister said the doomsday clock was still ticking, but a bomb disposal team was on site. With details of today's announcements, here's our environment analyst, Roger Harrabin.
With the world already experiencing dangerous heating, it's vital for this conference to produce more than what the activist Greta Thunberg calls blah blah blah. Today, world leaders took some significant steps. More than 100 of them promised to reverse deforestation by 2030. Then there's a pact to reduce emissions of methane by 30% by 2030. Methane's the second most important heating gas. The USA has signed the pledge, China and Russia have not. There's also a deal for major nations to work together to create standards and incentives to bring down the price of clean technology in electricity, hydrogen, road transport, agriculture and steel. These actions won't solve the problem, but they demonstrate some valuable new thinking.
President Biden has accused China and Russia of failing to show leadership on climate change by missing the summit in Glasgow. As world leaders head home, leaving negotiators to work over the remaining 10 days of the conference, our political editor Laura Koonsberg considers if the event is on course to achieve its aims.
Boris Johnson has played host for a frantic 48 hours, but it's now the hard bargaining begins, particularly over the cash that countries are prepared to pay to make the expensive move to greener economies. COP insiders seem relieved. The opening of the summit has not been perfect, but leaders have produced promises and targets within the highly controlled secure zone. The atmosphere seems, so far, so good, but there is anxiety about what's next. When the Prime Minister returns towards the end of the fortnight, it's unclear at this stage exactly what kind of deal will lie in wait.
Boris Johnson has said the row with France over post-Brexit fishing rights is vanishingly unimportant when compared with tackling climate change. The Prime Minister insisted that the UK's position had not changed in the dispute, which centres around the number of licences granted to small French boats. Paris suspended a threat to introduce sanctions against the UK as discussions continue to resolve the row, a decision welcomed by the Environment Secretary George Eustace.
We made clear last week that we thought the threats that France made were disproportionate. We felt they were very disappointing because we'd been implementing the agreement. We just very much welcome the fact that France has stepped back from that course of action. And of course, we continue to have dialogue.
Investigators have revealed that Sunday's train crash in Salisbury may have been caused by wheels slipping on the rails. The Rail Accident Investigation Branch said preliminary findings suggested the train couldn't stop at a red signal, even though it braked. Andrew Plant reports.
Rail investigators say they've looked at the train's data recorders and the signalling system on the track. As the first train passed through the tunnel, a red signal was given, telling the second train to stop. Instead, the two collided and partially derailed. Investigators say the second train did try to brake, but was unable to stop in time. The most likely cause described as low adhesion between the wheels and the track. In other words, it skidded.
Two Metropolitan Police officers who photographed the bodies of two sisters who had been murdered in a park in northwest London have been warned they face prison when they're sentenced next month. PC Dennis Jaffa, who's 47, and 33-year-old PC Jamie Lewis both admitted misconduct in a public office. after taking pictures of Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry last summer. Helena Wilkinson was at the Old Bailey.
PC Jaffa and PC Lewis appeared in the dock next to each other. They had been guarding the crime scene where the sisters' bodies were found, but breached a cordon to take photographs of the bodies, which they then shared on a WhatsApp messaging app. Lewis edited one of the pictures, superimposing his face on with the victims in the background. The image was sent on by Jaffa to a female colleague and 3 friends via WhatsApp. Judge Lou Craft QC told them the matters were extremely serious and warned them that they would receive custodial sentences.
The Islamic State group says it carried out an attack on a military hospital in the Afghanistan capital, Kabul, which left at least 25 people dead. Gunmen stormed the building after setting off 2 explosions. The hospital was being used to treat Taliban fighters and former government soldiers. A 4-year-old girl who went missing in Australia over a fortnight ago has been found alive and well. Pierre Smith, who disappeared from a tent she was sleeping in with her family on a remote campsite, was discovered in a locked house in her hometown of Carnarvon in Western Australia. A man is being questioned by police. The government's plan to temporarily suspend the so-called triple lock, which links wage rises to increases in pensions, has been defeated in the House of Lords. Ministers argue that a freak rise in earnings caused by the recovery from the pandemic would make a similar increase in pensions unaffordable. The bill will now go back to the Commons. Passengers at Berlin's new airport have been warned not to drink water from any of the terminal's taps after harmful bacteria were discovered during a routine test. A spokesperson said it would take several days to resolve the problem. From Berlin, here's Jenny Hill.
Berlin's new airport opened last year, nearly a decade late and billions of euros over budget, after a series of scandals, setbacks and technical problems. Executives hope the inauguration, albeit one in the middle of a global pandemic, would mark a fresh start. But the airport continues to make headlines for all the wrong reasons. Today it emerged that passengers have been warned not to drink from the terminal's taps after routine testing found bacteria which can cause vomiting and diarrhea in the water supply. It comes just days after the airport's chief executive warned that without further financial aid, it would run out of money early next year.
Jenny Hill reporting.
Thank you, Caroline. You're listening to The World Tonight with Nicola Shah in London and James Menendez at the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow.
Yes, the first stage of this 2-week-long summit is now over. World leaders are heading home in their motorcades and private jets, leaving their delegations to get down to the hard graft of what are hugely complex and often head-scratchingly technical negotiations. The outcome of those will emerge later in the month. But today did see a few carefully staged, managed announcements, including commitments to end deforestation and reduce emissions of methane, a particularly potent greenhouse gas. Before leaving Glasgow, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson gave his verdict on progress so far.
We must take care to guard against false hope and not to think in any way that the job is done, because it is not. There is still a very long way to go. But all that being said, I am cautiously optimistic. If this was a football match, then the current score would be 5-1 down in the match between humanity and climate change. And I think what you could say today, after 2 days of talks with around 120 world leaders, is that we've pulled back a goal, or perhaps even 2.
On methane, more than 100 countries have now signed up to an initiative to reduce emissions by a third by the end of the decade. The United States and the European Union have been trying to garner support for their initiative since they first unveiled it a couple of months ago. It's President Biden.
One of the most important things we can do in this decisive decade is to keep 1.5 degrees in reach as we reduce our methane emissions as quickly as possible. It's one of the most potent greenhouse gases there is. It amounts to about half the warming we're experiencing today. So together, we're committing to collectively reduce our methane by 30% by 2030, and I think we could probably go beyond that.
So how will that reduction actually be achieved? Drew Shindell is Professor of Earth Sciences at Duke University in the US and a leading expert on methane pollution.
The easiest
source of methane to tackle are leaks from the fossil fuel sector. And so by reducing deliberate venting or flaring of gas that's found when you're drilling for oil or extracting gas and get more than you bargained for at the beginning is one way. Another is fixing accidental leaks. And then there'll be some progress as well, although more modest, in the waste and agricultural sectors.
And how difficult a task is it in technical terms to do the things you mentioned?
Well, that's what's really wonderful about methane, is the controls are not technically difficult. They are in fact practiced in many parts of the world, and we need those places that do not have these best practices put in place already to follow the example that's done elsewhere. And so the technology is there, it's readily done, it's achievable. And the other thing that we have learned by putting these leak repairs and methane capture rather than release into practice is that it's financially very appealing. You might have to pay a little bit of upfront to, say, buy a compressor, but then you push this methane along in your pipeline before you open it up to work on it and you have more product to sell. So the measures often, they're technically achievable, and they typically pay for themselves in a very short period of time.
But, as I understand it, this agreement isn't binding. What compulsion is there then for the signatories to do their bit?
Well, there isn't, and that's a great point. And so that's where we really have to see if today is the first step along a road that leads to genuine reductions, or today was a great starting point which doesn't have adequate follow-through. So the countries that have signed on, this huge number of countries now, they really need to put into place domestic regulations in order to meet these targets. So that's the next step.
And also, I imagine, to get China, Russia on board?
That is definitely the other big remaining issue here, is that we have, more than 2/3 of the world's economies, but we're still missing several of the key emitting countries, and in particular, the two you just named, China and Russia. And so we either need to have them sign on, or we need to use the fact that we have such a large portion of the world's economies committed to reducing methane to add some economic pressure. Hopefully the fact that there's this new pledge with so many signatories by itself begins to generate political pressure. But if that's not enough, it might take some economic pressure, say border taxes on imported gas.
And so, all being well, if this cut of 30% is achieved, what might be the impact on global warming?
Well, that's a great thing about reducing methane, is the impacts are substantial and they're rapid. And so we would see a drop of around 0.2 of a degree in warming just a decade or so later, around 2040 to 2050. And that's really the strongest lever we have to reduce the damaging impacts of climate change in the first half of this century. So it sounds like a small number, but it's probably about the best we're going to do. But at the same time, if we achieve these cuts by 2030, we see public health and agriculture benefits due to reduced air pollution by 2030. These happen really, really rapidly. So that's what makes methane controls a great and valuable and necessary complement to CO2 reductions, which take a long time to yield benefits.
Professor Drew Shindell of Duke University. Ritala, I have to say it's become much quieter here at the summit venue in Glasgow now that the leaders and the light sprinkle of Hollywood glitz has departed. But that will mean fewer distractions for those left behind to get down to work. They have 10 days to make progress. How much? Well, we'll have to wait to find out. Back to you in the studio.
Let the negotiations begin. James Menendez in Glasgow, thank you so much. Well, Joe Biden can chalk up the global methane pledge as a success, but before he arrived in Glasgow, the limits of his green credentials were underlined by his inability to pass a bill which includes a massive $555 billion for clean energy credits and incentives. The president will return to the US to hear the results of the election for Virginia's next governor. The incumbent, a Democrat, Terry McAuliffe, is hoping to win a second term, but polls suggest Democrats and Republicans are in a dead heat. Elena Treen is congressional reporter for the Axios News website, and she joins me now. Good evening.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Elena Treen's success in Glasgow then for Joe Biden to some extent, but how damaging was it for him not to get approval, that vote through Congress for his Build Back Better plan and the second package of proposals known as Caring Economy?
It was very much significant, and the reason is because Biden has been working on this agenda for, even before he became president. He had been promising big, bold policies, particularly on climate change, and it's something I've met with several different diplomats and aides to ambassadors in D.C. over the past several weeks, and they've reiterated over and over again how important the climate aspect of this Build Back agenda initiative is for the administration, particularly when you see what other countries who are part of this conference this week in Glasgow, how much they have done on the climate change front. And so I think that it's good that he can go there, that he could go there and say, look at what we're doing, how close we are, here are the policies that we're pushing. But the fact that there isn't an agreement, and especially when it's very visible, the squabbling within the Democratic Party on this issue, it does hurt him in a big way.
So that legislative agenda remains in the balance. Lots of divisions opening up among the Democrats. But Virginia's also going to the polls today in what could be a very significant vote.
Yes, very significant. And then the reason why, not just people within Virginia are worried about this, but Democrats, particularly overall, look at Virginia as a key state, and they see this election as a bellwether for the broader dynamics that will be in play come the 2022 midterms, which is just about a year away now.
So what would defeat in Virginia indicate for Joe Biden?
Well, I think it would just show how he really needs to deliver on the policy front. He's had a really tough time. His poll numbers are sagging. We've seen him take a big hit after what happened in Afghanistan and the withdrawal. There's also concerns across the country of rising coronavirus cases given the Delta variant, and he hasn't really delivered on some of the key things that he's promised. And so that's really something that particularly Democrats in Virginia and Terry McAuliffe's team really wanted these packages to be passed to help give him a boost.
And briefly, the Republican opponent, Glenn Youngkin, how has he, if you like, played the Trump factor in his campaign?
It's really interesting to see how he's navigated a Republican candidate running in a competitive race in the Trump era. And we kind of branded this as Trump light at Axios. He's not fully attached himself to the former president, but he's not abandoning him either. And I think in a place like Virginia, a battleground, more of a purple state, how he accepts help from the former president and distance himself as well is really key. And Glenn Youngkin has been very sure not to tie himself too closely to Donald Trump.
An interesting race. We shall look out for the result. Elena Treen from Axios, thanks very much. Well, across the US, local school board races have also emerged as an intense political background in those elections, with much at stake for the students. There are fights over mask mandates, vaccine requirements, and how American history and diversity is presented in the curriculum. Typically calm school board meetings have turned into screaming matches, and parents are preventing their children from spending time with their friends if they come from politically opposite families. BBC's Sophie Long reports from Colorado.
The sounds of sleepy suburban life. People perfecting already pretty pristine lawns dotted with carved pumpkins and friendly ghosts that will light up pathways later.
Hi! Just want to make sure if you haven't voted yet, then you can scan that to see where to drop off don't mail it, because it won't get it in time.
It's Halloween in Castle Rock, Colorado. The school board candidate, Julie Watkins, knocks on doors trying to drum up support. But much scarier than any giant spider dangling from russet fall trees is the intensity of this normally non-partisan election. Sarah Wu is Julie Watkins' campaign manager.
If you step back and think about it, it's a school board election.
in one county in the entire United States. But to us, it's everything about our children's education. And each side is trying to say, we know what's right, and the other side, it's not just wrong, it's evil. Everything about them is just going to destroy our children.
Mask mandates have caused a major commotion here. They've led to school board members being attacked and intimidated, trolled on social media, and stalked in public. School board meetings degenerate into shouting matches that are now policed by armed security guards.
Seeing the kids in a mask all the time, no smiles, it's just very dehumanizing.
Teacher Stacey Adair is currently on unpaid leave for refusing to wear a mask in the classroom. Now she spends her time canvassing for school board candidates who share her view.
People were just so intense about it. It was an insane year. I was willing to get written up for not enforcing the mask. If they want to wear the mask, fine. If they take it off because they want to breathe, it's not my job. There's nowhere in my job description that says I'm a mask enforcer.
It's not just mask mandates that have wiped the smiles off parents and teachers' faces at a cheerleading contest. There are claims that schools are teaching critical race theory, the idea that racism is embedded in America's public policies. It's led to teachers being accused of indoctrinating children while they watch their academic scores tumble faster than the flyer when the bases lose their grip.
We all know the Dr. King quote that has been shared. Color of our skin versus the content of our character. He had a dream. This is a nightmare. It is a nightmare for our children, and it needs to end now.
That was Deborah Flora speaking at a school board meeting earlier this year. She's so incensed by this, she's decided to run for the Senate in 2022.
Parents are an expert in their own children, and they don't want to be an expert in teaching them. But we can look at the facts and say, look, our children are failing academically, and then you're telling them to be ashamed of who they are or that they're a victim. So it's not about micromanaging the classroom. It is about finally electing school boards who understand what the job of schools are, which is to educate kids.
But teacher Forrest Sheets says they've just modernized the syllabus and are teaching history more accurately and inclusively.
We're just trying to make them aware from both perspectives and let them make up their mind as to how they feel about that afterwards. And I think that's kind of what teaching history should be about.
What should be a non-partisan election focusing on things like teachers' pay and building maintenance appears to have become deeply political. Given the opposing sides can't even agree whether that's true or whether it's a good thing, it's likely to continue.
Sophie Long reporting. Between 1992 and 1995, the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina claimed more than 100,000 lives and made around 2 million people homeless.
In a village 2 miles south of Zvornik, we came upon the human calamity, which is the practical result of all this. 2,000 Muslims are stranded and struggling to get out. They spoke of the fighting they'd left behind them, the murder and hostage-taking which went with it.
Terrible things are happening now. They have been happening since 2-3 days. It's a terrible terror which has been made and which is being made right now. We can hear even now some shells.
We could, and so could the refugees waiting for rescue. The artillery barrage was creeping towards us in the villages on the Muslim side of Zvornik. Numbers are difficult to estimate, but in single file on mountain paths and great columns on the wider tracks, it's possible that as many as 20,000 people are on the move, most of them by foot. These had been walking for 2 days, they had gone 18 miles, had at least another 20 to go along this trail of tears.
Martin Bell reporting from Zvornik in April 1992. It was the signing of the Dayton Peace Accord in December 1995 by the presidents of Croatia, Serbia and Bosnia that finally brought the war to an end. But now the international community's chief representative in Bosnia has warned the country is in danger of breaking up. In a report for the UN, Christian Schmidt warns also that there is a real prospect of conflict. Since the war, the country's consisted of 2 self-governing entities, the Bosnian Serb Republic and a Muslim Croat Federation, which are lightly bound by a central government. but there's a new drive towards separatism from some on the ethnic Serbian side. Milorad Dodik, the president of the country, is threatening to pull his piece of Bosnia out of state-level institutions, including the army. Baroness Arminka Helic, is a Conservative peer who's from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and she told PN she's concerned by Milorad Dodik's actions.
If we don't take decisive action, this is going to go in the very wrong place, because if the leader of the secessionists in Bosnia, Mr. Dodik, is calling for establishing his own army, and that army, let's remember, in the 1990s was found guilty of certain crimes against humanity and genocide. If there is an attempt to establish your own intelligence security agency, if there is an attempt to block the state-level indirect taxation authority and really collapse the state from inside, there is nothing left. I don't want to say this, but you're almost getting your own Afghanistan situation where the country collapses.
Well, Valentin Inzko used to occupy the OHR, the Office of the High Representative for Bosnia. He stepped down at the end of July. I asked him if Bosnia was in danger of falling apart.
Well, if we compare the situation as it was the last 25 years, maybe we have now really an escalation of rhetoric. We have an escalation of statements about leaving state institutions, etc. In this sense, maybe we didn't have such a situation for the last 2 decades.
Why do you think there is this escalation now?
There is this open threat of the Serb leader Milorad Dodik, who likes to secede from Bosnia and Herzegovina. He has announced already concrete measures. He said he will create his own army, he will leave judiciary, etc. He's also at the same time arming his police. He is buying long weapons, etc. So this is his long-term plan, as it was during the war, to get independence of Republika Srpska. But as you know, Republika Srpska is part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it only exists thanks to Dayton.
But this is the fear, isn't it, that Mr. Dodik is willing to override Dayton to take Bosnia back to the state it was in before those accords were signed?
There is no possibility to secede in Dayton. This is not foreseen. Or the leaders have agreed to such a Bosnia which we have today. You see, people always speak, the Dayton Agreement brought peace, but it also preserved the borders, which are more than 200 years old. The Serb leader Milosevic and some others also who agreed to this arrangement, including also, of course, Russia.
Back in July, when you were still in post, you imposed effectively a ban on genocide denial, something that was received furiously by Mr. Dodik at the time. Do you think that escalated tensions?
This was called a trigger, but actually we have statements from Mr. Dodik for the last 12 or 15 years about independence, about peaceful dissolution. And he said, I think it was last year, we will not recognize even the weather forecast.